What pictures come to mind when you think of complexity? Maybe it's something abstract, a kind of dream of complexity. Or maybe it's more mathematical, the complexity of fractals. Many people are introduced to complexity through nature, like starlings moving in what's called a murmuration. It's magical. When you watch, you wonder, how does that work? The same for schools of fish. Our eye goes back and forth between the individual fish and the great shape they make together. Each second demonstrates the wonder of emergence, a pattern appearing without control, without intention, emerging from the constant interaction between each fish in the school. Dancers and the dance, both are real. An ant colony is a good example. If you watch an individual ant, you'd probably not be very impressed with its intelligence. But a colony of ants can feed and defend itself, reproduce, and survive through the cold winter, all because of the interactions between those many thousands of individuals. Unlike ants, people aren't driven purely by chemical signals. Our lives can be reliably predicted by equations. We make stories. We tell stories to each other. We're influenced by our long history of relationships, whether loving or traumatic. We can influence each other across long distances and great spans of time. We've learned to use technology to extend our senses. Human complexity is not like the complexity of ants or fish. We do participate in emergence, and we experience long-term emergent patterns. You experience these things every day. How is it that we have transformed our planet, even though no one actually set out to do so? How did your group of friends come to be connected? How is it true that your school is still your school, even though it may have changed locations and none of the same people are there as before? In the first episode, we looked at a model. The bottom left is where we can easily see what's needed and find the tools to make things better. At larger scales, as we seek to have more lasting impact, we encounter the invisible depths of people's experience and relationships. We're working in complexity and emergence, and everything becomes more difficult to see. I'm Mark Reddig, and this is episode 2 of the Emergent Approaches series. The question of this series is, how can we create together? As we saw in the first episode, what we're really asking is, given that social situations are complex, emergent, woven with traumatic history and fertile with possibilities, how can we create together? In this episode, we'll ask a more specific question. How can we learn to better see in complexity together? We'll talk about this question at 3 scales. Personal, developing our ability to see through complexity glasses. Group, helping groups of people see together. And community or organization or system scale. Let's start with individual scale. That's you and me. For me, the big ideas are exciting, and it's so valuable to learn things about complexity and emergence. But I find it doesn't really change my work unless it gets into the way I see. What do I do with these big ideas? That's easier to answer as the ideas start to change the way we see situations, challenges, and possibilities. I've found I start to see differently through practice, through experience. So I thought I'd report what I've tried and what's been valuable for me. When I first began learning about complexity, I really wanted to start seeing differently, but I wasn't having much success. It can be both overwhelmingly much and mostly invisible. My head had a hard time making use of notions like emergence. But still I tried. I thought, they say that in living systems, relationships matter more than things. But I'm so used to things. Can I learn to see differently? So I played around with just drawing relationships. At the time, my work involved spending time with a lot of families. I was doing ethnographic style design research, so lots of interviews, lots of hanging out in people's houses. I tried drawing the relationships first rather than the people. And I wondered what it would be like to draw the families as though they were living creatures. This creature has 4 segments: father, son, the relationship the father thinks he has with his son, and the relationship the son thinks he has with the father. It's a little weird to draw relationships as things, but at least this gets them out where I can look at them and talk about them. In this case, it was good to notice that those 2 relationship creature things are different. Here's a couple. A lot of their friends see them as a single sort of being. I'm friends with George and Emily. But it's Emily they're really friends with. George tends to focus inwardly on himself and their family life. It's this dynamic, this process, that makes up the George-Emily creature. I found that the more I sketched, the more I was learning to see in terms of relationships, and I started to develop a kind of visual language. These bars and broken lines are borrowed from anthropology and social network theory, but they gained personal meaning for me that grew the more I looked and doodled. And this family has a lot of blocked or conflicted relationships. Amy is the mom, and Chris is her husband. That gap between them is significant. There's relationship, but not much is flowing. She thinks of him as one of the boys, just like one of her sons. Some of the family are turned out towards their friends, and Amy's life is almost entirely turned inward toward the family. Having this kind of sketch of every family we visited changed the way we saw the people and their communities. I sometimes doodle while I'm in a meeting or on the phone, and I found during this time that my doodles were changing. I played with different ways to draw relationships. I tried drawing only relationships. These dots were the last thing I drew. For me, that was a way to practice a different kind of imagination. What if I could only see relationships and saw people and things as confluences of relationship, places where bundles of relationships come together? I started to feel the aliveness, the livingness of social structures, families and teams and organizations. I played with doodle language inspired by biology. Again, the dots were the last thing I drew. First came the relationships. The things, the dots, emerged at the intersections. I think there's something going on here. There's really a practice. It reminds me of Goethe's approach to science and nature. While Isaac Newton was directing light through a prism and making a theory of color, Goethe made a different theory by holding the prism up to his eye and looking through it directly. And he said that the way he was practicing seeing woke in him a new organ of inner understanding. Maybe you'd like to try. Try doodling the ideas you're learning about systems or complexity, emergence. Try sketching the things you encounter in your work, using the drawings to help you see through a complexity lens. Take an hour to walk around the city or sit in the park or museum or coffee shop and use your pencil to help you practice seeing. Here's another way to practice. When you're out and about in the world, try putting on your imaginary complexity goggles or systems, relationship, emergence goggles. It's not easy at first, and it's hard to wear them for very long, but it's good practice. The other day I was in the waiting room of a healthcare clinic. It was a clinic with maybe 10 doctors and all their supporting nurses and staff. I was just waiting, I had some time, and it occurred to me to try out a relationship lens. I thought, wow, the unbelievable cords and cables of relationship weaving out from this place. They go all over town. I looked at this man waiting and imagined the threads out to his family, to the doctor, his co-workers. It's not that it was so revealing. I had no big insight, but it was practice. Imaginary lines became a little boring. The 2 ladies in the back having a conversation a line between them is not interesting, but I thought, let's try seeing everyone as a process. What's being created as they talk? Created or strengthened or nudged. They each brought something. They brought who they are. They're in the presence of one another's something they brought. I imagined a kind of field created by them bringing themselves together. 2 weeks ago, I was in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and there was an installation of mirrors facing one another, and people crowded in to enjoy the view of endless versions of themselves. And because I'd been practicing, I was struck by what an image of becoming this is. The long parade of versions of each person stretching back through time, healthy or hurt, confident or worried. I imagined that some of the images were ancestors, people with their parents behind them who shaped their ideas and experience, and then grandparents and generations stretching back into the mirror. We're each a process, each becoming the next version of ourselves, each dwelling at the place where who we think we are meets who we might become. And again, I thought about what's being created between and among the people in these moments. I don't know how to visualize it. I don't claim anything profound about these sketches. I filtered and colored these pictures after the fact as a way to communicate at least a little what my imagination does when I put on systems glasses, emergence glasses, becoming relationship glasses. It's not the result, it's the practice. Maybe you'd like to try. Here are different kinds of systems goggles you can offer to your imagination as you go through your day. A photo walk. There's something about a camera that changes how we see. When you go out in the morning, give yourself an assignment of taking 10 pictures of relationship or emergence or whatever you'd like to try seeing. If you like, print them out that evening and draw on them. Free writing. Set a timer for 10 minutes, look at your pictures, and write without stopping about the complexity you see. You're sitting in a coffee shop, get out your notebook and write about the relationships and emergence that surrounds you. It's practice. Goethe goggles. He encouraged us to try to see everything in nature as a process. If we can't look at a flower and see its movement from seed to sprout, then flower, and eventually decaying back into the soil, Goethe said, we don't understand the flower unless we can see it that way. How does that apply in the coffee shop? Let's talk about seeing together. This question of how a group of people can better see together, this has probably changed my own work more than anything. We could say that small groups are the unit of work for systems change, the coal face. This is the place where our own personal practices come into relationship, and where that can happen in a group that's able to create well together, come together with others, and where we can learn to collaborate in a way that affects something bigger than this one group. There are so many ways to support group seeing. I'll mention a few just to give you an idea of the range, and then point to some resources. There's a whole family of methods I categorize as dialogue methods, conversations that matter. Here's a story about a simple one my colleague and I invented for a particular situation. We worked with an IT department in a big company. IT, information technology, they make software and manage the computer systems for the whole company. But they were disconnected from the departments they served. We gathered a bunch of IT folks with people from the sales department for 3 days of activities. And they didn't know each other, and they had very different group cultures. They'd been working in isolation, but had a desire to work in partnership. But first, they needed to really see each other and to see themselves through other people's eyes. So we asked each group to spend time preparing answers to 5 questions. The pictures show the IT group's answers. And here are the first 2 questions. What are you really good at? And what do you need in order to do a good job? So they took time to talk together and wrote their answers on big sheets of paper. The next two questions. What outside expectations do you face, and where do they come from? What kinds of projects or situations bring out the best in you or are most fun, really bring you alive? And then a fifth question. What are your undiscussables? Important topics you don't talk about because you're afraid or they're too uncomfortable, so you avoid them, or it doesn't seem okay in your group's culture. We said they didn't have to answer, but they did. I'm skipping over a lot of the story here. Those 5 questions are one example of how a simple seeing activity can be powerful. As the two groups presented their answers to each other, the conversation had already begun to change. They surprised each other. I didn't know that about you. I expected you'd say something different. And in that conversation, something else happened. Each group began to see themselves through the other group's eyes. The words on the left are words we captured while listening to the conversation. The IT folks referred to themselves as makers. The salespeople said, "You're more than that. You know about possibilities we can't imagine. You are creators." And that stuck with the IT staff. It changed how they talked about themselves for the rest of the 3 days. We experienced this lesson over and over again. Seeing together, seeing each other, and seeing the situation together transforms the group. In social complexity, no single point of view can accurately see what's going on. And when a group of people spend enough time together, their view of a situation can converge into one. Group sight. There are many ways a group can refresh their attention and see through many people's eyes. Many of those methods involve stories. Here's a potent method called collective story harvest. This is one table in a room full of people, all from the same organization. They've gathered because they recently assessed the impact of their work and found that for all their hard efforts, they were making little change in the behavior they wanted to influence. They're an advocacy organization. It turns out they'd never met the people that they wanted to influence, folks who engaged in some pretty harmful behavior. And in this picture, it's about a half an hour before they're going to meet some of those people. And before those people arrive, this group is capturing their assumptions. What motivates these folks who engage in this harmful behavior? What relationships are important to them? How do they benefit from that negative behavior? What do they worry about? And so on. And then the storytellers arrived. And I'm going to kind of hurry through the steps. There's more that I'm telling. But after some introductions, people gathered in 4 listening groups. Each of the storytellers had prepared to tell the full story of their experience, starting at a young age. They were brave and quite vulnerable. And when someone is talking about choices you find objectionable, most people's impulse is to listen with judgment. But the goal was to listen with openness. After all, these were first-hand reports from the very system that this group is trying to affect. So can we listen actively and openly? And they could, partly because of some practice before the storytellers arrived, and partly because every listener had a listening job to do. We call them listening lenses. So you listen for the key moments and decisions. I'll listen for the inner experience and their emotions. And someone else will keep inventory of relationships and moments of communication. After the stories are over, the people who had each lens gather together and compare notes. So the room had held 4 stories, and in these groups we harvest the relationships from all 4, the emotions from all 4, and so on. And then everyone gathered back together and we had a big harvest of learning. What did we hear? What are we learning? Then the groups took time to update their original assumptions. Where had they made wrong assumptions? What new things did they learn? What was confirmed? And they put all the different lenses together for each story and made a picture called a journey map. Now they could see the key moments in the story, what the person was thinking and feeling, who else was there, and the room was transformed. This intensity of listening and seeing had turned distant, abstract others, people who behaved badly, who we wouldn't want to be around, into full human stories. People they actually liked. People who had participated all their lives in a strong system of influence. So by the end of the work, this organization had a new set of verbs to guide its work, where they used to persuade, convince, educate. They now set out to equip, connect, help, inspire, invite, enable, support. This is another example of the way the act of seeing together, really opening and paying attention together, can transform the group's relationship to the larger system in which it participates, and its relationship to its own purpose and work. Nora Bateson has coined the term warm data, which I'd like to mention here. Often when we talk about seeing systems, the expectation is it will produce maps and diagrams, entities and relationships, and causal loops, and sources and sinks and flows. In Bateson's language, that's the cold data. Not that it's bad, it's just that it's inadequate on its own, and it does not capture the life of the system. Warm data lives in people and relationships. Boxes and arrows on the wall, however useful, are not people, are not relationships. There are whole communities of practice out there that are supporting and advancing this kind of work. Here are a few links to get you started. I'll add more in the notes that accompany this video. If you're just starting out, I think the liberating structures, methods, and community is a great way to begin. In the first episode, I mentioned that a theme of this series is work that aims up and to the right in our landscape of ways of creating together. That means at larger social scales and with intent for a deep and lasting shift to a life-sustaining society. When we work with whole communities or systems, the scale and complexity, the long-established invisible patterns, how do we see? I can't tell you how to do it, but I can tell a few stories, show some useful examples. Making maps and diagrams, that seems to be the thing a lot of us try first. There's a whole history and practice of diagramming systems and a lot of literature and teaching about it. It's so common that, well, we have to talk about it. But I find that we have to use it with care. There are risks. It's so easy to bring our lower left mindset, the mindset of parts and assemblies, cause and effect, problems and solutions to the way we make our maps. It really is useful to have a big picture of it all that's shared in common and of the geography of the work. And the process we need to go through to make a map like this, that's valuable too. You don't do this without really digging in and paying attention. I do find that too often mapping tends to be done by a group of insiders, a group of experts. The analysis is what Nora Bateson would call cold, distant from the life of people, relationships, and emotion. And even though we know the map is not the territory, it's too easy to forget that. The distance is comfortable, and so is the illusion of certainty. The best maps help us tell stories about the system, the big forces at play and the patterns they maintain. The best maps not only help us see the present, but invite speculation and generative conversation about where creative attention should be paid. And if we're going to be mapping or really using any of the approaches in this series, we need to be asking questions like, who is making this and who is left out? Who's going to use it for what and who will benefit? How is this map connected to patterns of power in the system? I've seen some effective work that really did involve the entire community in a kind of mapping or model making as a way to spark new conversation and level the power in those conversations and invite fresh imagination. These folks are scientists, engineers, staff, and administrators who work at a national research lab that does basic physics research. Over the course of 2 months, nearly 1,000 people went through an exercise of group model making. The reason was that the lab's original founding purpose, their why, was no longer relevant. They needed a new why in order to have a meaningful conversation about their priorities and their future. In small and large groups, they saw through many points of view and they made models out of craft materials, models of their lab in the world having the kind of impact they believe will matter. The conversation changed the model, and the model changed the conversation. And these gatherings changed the conversations in meetings and at lunch tables for months after. The model-making groups worked in parallel. Then, groups gave each other tours of their models and took time for conversation about both futures and values. And then they gathered in rooms of as many as 200 people to grapple with their various ways of seeing. And this is one example of involving an entire community in seeing themselves together. The seeing was thoroughly tangled with conversation. Here's another way people use making and conversation as a tool for groups to try seeing a whole system. It works like this. Make a hypothesis starter model, and then convene the diversity of the system and different levels of power, and involve everyone in role-playing scenarios. Allow them to modify the map as they go, and repeat. Here's people using Lego to represent their system and play out scenarios. You can buy kits called Serious Play from Lego, and you can even become a certified serious play facilitator. Personally, I still prefer pipe cleaners and pasta and beans and craft materials and paper cutouts. But the representation connects to memory and imagination. The conversation reveals and creates and changes relationship. I mean, you can play out an hour or a day or a month or 3 months of the system and try out different scenarios, all in an afternoon or a day or a week. The model is the conversation piece, but the conversation does the work. As they imagine and play out scenarios and talk about it, people come to have new models in their minds. A shared model is built through conversation and enactment. They're practicing a systems view because they are having a systems conversation and a systems experience. If you'd like a quick way to get started, there are kits out there you can download to help you make your tabletop systems. This next one is the closest I've seen to a means of seeing together up and to the right, deeper at larger scale. It connects wonderfully from seeing to the next steps, making sense of what you've seen and choosing actions that you have reason to believe might affect the community's patterns. Here are the steps, which are going to seem like too much to take in. I'll use an example to make it more clear. You get a lot of stories, water cooler, lunch table kind of stories about people's experience, and the people who tell the stories get to say what their stories mean, rather than the professional researchers. That slogan we got from Chris Corrigan is, get your hands off the people's data, get your hands off the people's stories. Then you look for patterns in those stories. Some will be negative, some will be positive, and you can ask, how might we get more stories like this and fewer stories like that? And that can inspire a portfolio of little experiments or probes. We call them probes. They're probing to see if you have found a way to attract new patterns of behavior. And then you can get more stories to see if the patterns are shifting. Let's say we wanted to sense patterns of social life on a university campus. This approach is not like surveys where you're trying to gather opinions or guess which questions might really matter. Instead, you give hypothesis-free prompts for stories. What story about your own experience would you tell a friend or family member who is thinking about attending this school? Describe an experience that has positively or negatively influenced your studies or your quality of life on campus. Those are examples of the kind of stories we might gather. You can collect the stories on paper, but what really makes it fly is to use one of the software tools for this. More about that in a minute. But here we've gathered stories from a group of students. On the right, you can see that they've used dots on triangles and scales to tell us what their story means to them. When we look for patterns in this small sample, gathered just as a way of learning about the approach, we saw that the most negative stories tended to relate to student-faculty relationships. And that sounds like something worth exploring. Well, here's a bigger example. This involved the entire state of Kansas in the United States and used software called SenseMaker for story collection and sense-making. The reason for this project of statewide system sensing was to find ways to support struggling families. Families in Kansas had been disrupted in many ways, and some of those families were doing better than others. So how can governments and institutions and communities in the state better support family resilience? And these circles, these 4 colored circles, are from the website for the project and show the 4 big activities: sharing stories, be a partner in collecting stories, engage in community sense-making, and take action based on what's been learned. So let's look at these one at a time. This is the story prompt as it was presented in the SenseMaker software. You could either tell a story about something that happened in the last week that hurt you, your family, or a family you know, or you can remember a time when you felt like your family or another family was thriving or just surviving, and tell an experience that was happening at that time. And these are some of the what are called triads presented by the SenseMaker software. After telling their story, people would move the dots to indicate what their story means to them. The triangles define a kind of space or territory. So in the bottom right, number 4, who in the experience, who made sure people got what they needed? Family, government, friends, and community. The dot placed close to the edge means the government wasn't involved. It was mostly friends and community and a little bit of family for this story. Sometimes it's better to just use a simple slider. It can be surprising to read what sounds like a difficult story, then learn that the person who told it sees it as a positive story. The storyteller sees life differently than you. So that's one ingredient in this approach called narrative inquiry, where we're inquiring through narratives, right? We're gathering these stories. And here's one of the things that makes it participatory. Who's collecting the stories? They invited people to become citizen journalists. Teachers, community leaders, students, and so on would collect stories from people in their world. And organizations would gather stories from their people. They gathered over 2,000 stories from across the state, nearly 2,500. And then they hosted people who would spend time doing sense-making, finding patterns in the stories from their own part of the state. How does a system see itself? It's happening right here. Of course, software helps too. Here's a page from one of the regional reports that's noting 2 common family disruptors in their area: health crisis or other medical problem, or the arrival of a new child. This is another aspect of putting the participatory in what's called participatory narrative inquiry. It's not only who interprets the stories, but also who takes action. Everyone in the state was invited. They invited people to suggest an action that's a response to a story pattern. It's quick, just a first step, something done in their local community, and something that could be done for less than $2,000. The actions are suggested in response to patterns of stories. That's how this works. These are two of the triangles people use to indicate the meaning of their story, but now we have lots of dots. Every dot is a story. If you click on a dot, you can see the text of the story. And here are two interesting clusters. Stories where people felt they were facing something beyond their control, and stories where people were able to rely on support from others. So the strategic question to spark experiments becomes, how might we get more stories like these and fewer stories like those? This is one of the prompting documents from a community action workshop. The theme is summarized, the stories are available, and the question is there, more like these, fewer like those. And here's a description of one of the citizen-proposed actions that received financial support. Notice the things that were asked for in the description. What do you want to do? Who do you want to do it with? And why? What stories or pattern motivates the action? At the time of this report, 46 actions were funded across the state, all in response to this work of seeing together. We can't diagram our way into wise action in complexity. We can't see its patterns directly. We can't see human relationships or pains or dreams. Uncertainty, the feeling that we don't know what's really going on, that's the norm. The feeling that we aren't sure what's best to do, that's also the norm. But we can practice new ways of seeing. Practice seeing together. Practice staying in the uncertainty. Living into the questions. Taking small actions that may attract people to new patterns. We can expand our kit to include approaches and methods that are not adaptations of things born from a mechanistic diagnose and fix worldview. The best methods, the best ways of creating together, are born from our own patient, joyous participation in the weave of human complexity.